In the previous video, I raised the possibility that Liana did not in fact die in childbirth. While the situation which she was dwelling in very much led people to believe it was a death by childbirth, the symptoms could be something else. One possibility is that due to the difference in climate between the North and Dawn, she contracted some disease local to Dawn, and the unfamiliar climate was not so favourable to her northern constitution that she came down with a disease and died. The other possibility is that she was poisoned by one of her companions, and many such poisons can be made to appear that they died in childbirth or due to old age or some other natural causes. The best poisons always leave one in doubt if it was poison at all. As to the matter of climate, empires in the real world tend to, at least prior to the age of sail, run longitudinally. Since the agrarian and pastoral zones tend to lie within certain latitudes, this places constraints on where people can live and thus be conquered and taxed and whatnot. However, where you are born determines your preferred climate, and if you stray too far outside that climate, especially before modern times when we had vaccines and other advanced medical care, moving to a foreign climate risks contracting disease which is native to the locals but alien to you. This appears in George R. R. Martin's work, especially with the Isle of Nath, in which Missandei is from. Many slavers go there because the Nathi are considered the best slaves, but 9 out of 10 foreigners who step forth on that island die of what is called butterfly fever. So George R. R. Martin considers this in his work. Consider the Mongol Empire, which reached a vast distance over land. However, there were certain biomes in which the Mongols could not easily push into. This was due to their native climate, and that of their horses and their composite bows, which were the backbone of their war machine. The steppes in which they lived were rather arid and cold and covered with grass. This led them to breeding grass-fed horses, as well as composite bows which were made of horn often and bone glued together. The horses could not subsist on grain, and the bows would delaminate in the presence of too much moisture. The Mongols rather quickly were able to conquer northern China, which ironically had the strongest warriors amongst the Chinese, the Liao dynasty, which for itself was a former steppe nomads who settled and conquered northern China. The Mongols had a much harder time conquering southern China, who lacked a pedigree for cavalry. And while they had large armies, they were poor quality troops. But what stalled the Mongol advances was the many river systems, the southern Chinese navy, the tropical diseases, which they were unsuited for in that climate, and their horses, as well as the stone fortifications of the Song dynasty. And this problem became even further exacerbated when they finally conquered the Song dynasty, but tried to push into countries like Vietnam, where they made no progress whatsoever. When world-building your fantasy empires, it pays to consider how geography constrains military expansion. One of the major exceptions to this rule is the Incan Empire in southern America. It tended to run north to south rather than east to west. It's also one of the few examples of a planned economy that lasts for a few hundred years, when planned economy means communism in this case. However, the Incan Empire is the exception that proves the rule, as its entire basis was in the mountains of the Andes, which would normalize the climate irrespective of the latitude. It existed in isolation and was reluctant to push down into the vast jungles of Southern America, which were notorious for disease. George, in creating Westeros, created a continent which was divided amongst many different biomes, many different climate areas, and divided by geography. Prior to the Targaryen conquest, each of the great kingdoms remained largely in their own comfort zones. The Riverlands, which was very much a construct of the Targaryen dynasty, was kind of a no man's land in which the North, the Vale, the Westerlands, and the Stormlands fought over. And prior to Aegon's conquest, the Ironborn took control of that region, building Harrenhal. During Aegon's conquest itself, Aegon and his dragons conquered the middle of Westeros, using the supernatural power of the dragons to achieve much of the victories they had. The ethnically distinct North, with their different religion and their cold climate, chose to vassalize rather than have to fight. And the Southern Dornish, with their high Warnish customs, held out for hundreds of years before eventually integrating through a diplomatic marriage. The Targaryen dynasty was only able to hold together this continent for less than 300 years, and only one generation later, the continent of Westeros is ready to split up into its respective kingdoms once more. In Dorne, they tend to make use of many hot spices in order to flavour their food, but beyond merely providing flavour, spices also act as a pre-modern method of preventing disease. Now, the condition which we find Lyanna in at the start of Game of Thrones in Eddard's recollections is that she was suffering from a fever. The fever had taken her strength, and her voice had been as faint as a whisper. Bloody discharge, and Lyanna in her bed of blood. The possible causes of this could in fact be a bad childbirth, of course, and there is a condition in Westeros called childbed fever, which in real-world discourse is postpartum infection. However, in the Song of Ice and Fire, there's the bloody flux, also known as the Pale Mare, which you see in Daenerys' chapters. His fever was not brought on by the arrow. He had soiled himself not once but many times. The stains reached to his knees, and there was dried blood amongst his excrement. Daenerys 5, A Dance with Dragons. Now, Sir Arthur Dayne, as a stony Dorchman, would likely be resistant to whatever was in the mountains in terms of disease. Valyrians, such as Rhaegar in this case, would be immune to simple diseases like the bloody flux. In Fire and Blood, it is noted as one of the conditions of Targaryen exceptionalism that Targaryens, like Jaehaerys and Alysanne, were immune to simple diseases like the bloody flux. "I am the blood of the dragon," Dany reminded him. "Have you ever seen a dragon with the flux?" Viserys had oft claimed that Targaryens were untroubled by the pestilences that afflicted common men, and so far as she could tell, it was true. She could remember being cold and hungry and afraid, but never sick. Daenerys 6, A Dance with Dragons. Lyanna, however, would have no such protection. Thus we come to poisons. In Eddard's A Game of Thrones chapter, where he's discussing with Robert the death of Jon Arryn, he is also discussing Lyanna. The two characters are being conflated, which leaves us to the possibility, while Jon Arryn, we eventually find out, was poisoned, it's an entirely distinct possibility that Lyanna was also poisoned. And this conflation, in which George creates in the very first chapter, which she has mentioned, could, in its own subtle way, suggest she was also poisoned. And among the many poisons, there are a couple of candidates which stand out. The first is Tears of Lys, the one which in turn killed Jon Arryn. Its effects are bloody stool, as with the bloody flux, which you find in Fire and Blood, when Rhaenyra's husband, Andro Farman, poisons the Dragonstone Maester, as well as Rhaenyra's many lady companions, out of jealousy, and he uses the Tears of Lys. And with Jon Arryn, we are told by Pycelle that Jon Arryn suffered from gut complications as well as a fever. Jon Arryn also, in his final hours, called out for Robert, as Lyanna was shouting out for Eddard. Perhaps a coincidence, perhaps not. There is one other poison which I think bears mentioning at this moment, and that's Wolfsbane, another of these poisons in Graham Pycelle's collection. In real life it's referred to as aconite, also monkshood. Some of the effects of aconite poisoning include nausea, dizziness, vomiting, and diarrhea, many of which would appear like a fever. One of the other conditions is respiratory paralysis, and her voice had been faint as a whisper. Motor weakness, the fever had taken her strength, so her limbs stopped having the strength they would once have. Aconite was used throughout history. It's a very old poison. As an arrow poison, the Greeks would tend to tip their arrows in poison, aconite often. They're referred to as toxitae. It could also be used as a medicine in small doses for treating gout and other conditions, but it was most often associated with killing of predators like tigers and wolves. It was planted around, often to discourage wolves, but also the mythical werewolf seemed to be either a poison which could kill a werewolf, or perhaps as a cause for a person turning into a werewolf if they consumed aconite during the full moon. And if we know anything about the Starks and the Song of Ice and Fire, they often are conflated with werewolves. Their long-storied ability to warg, lost to time, as it were, leaves many of the uneducated to conflate them with werewolves themselves. The Boltons tend to skin Starks whenever they get the chance. You can hear that vampires versus werewolves motif there. Thus, wolfsbane might be considered a very poetic poison to use against a Stark by someone with dark humour. So, if Lyanna was poisoned, who is the likely suspect? For those of you who follow the notion that Old Town, for the downfall of House Targaryen, the obvious suspect is Gerald Hightower. As for opportunity, he is at the Tower of Joy, at least towards the end of Lyanna's stay there. House Hightower, which runs Old Town, is closely affiliated with the Citadel. Therefore, we suspect they have access to rare poisons, given their relationship to the Maesters. And Gerald Hightower, who is past his prime, or at least according to Jaime, would not want to confront Sir Arthur Dayne and Sir Oswell Whent in one-to-one combat, if his goal was to kill Lyanna and eliminate a possible scion of House Targaryen, especially one linked to prophecy. He wouldn't be able to fight one or both of the two Kingsguard left to guard her. Thus, he would have to use a more subtle means of getting rid of her. Old Town, prior to the Targaryen conquest of the Seven Kingdoms, was the main trading port in the continent. King's Landing replaced Old Town as the main trading port, which has probably cost the Hightowers and the Faith of the Seven and the Citadel quite a bit of money over the centuries. They would want to reclaim their former primacy in the continent, and in fact had divided Westeros, which was split into many smaller kingdoms, all of which were subscribed to the Faith of the Seven, would be their ideal situation, as they could maintain a sort of clerical hegemony over the continent without having to incur the administrative and military costs of maintaining an empire. The Hightower's close association with the Faith of the Seven, who has been the most outwardly disapproving of the Targaryen practices, most of the dragons, as well as the incest and the polygamy, have been among House Targaryen's staunchest enemies. The Hightowers have often played middlemen between the two, but they are generally not to be trusted and would gain significantly from the House Targaryen's dissolution. House Hightower is steeped in sorcery and prophecy themselves, and they once upon a time received a prophecy that if they opposed House Targaryen openly, House Hightower would fall, so thus they don't oppose them directly or militarily. The one time which this almost happened was during the Dance of the Dragons, but they did so under the aegis of having half of House Targaryen supporting them. Another thing to consider is that Sir Gerald wasn't one of Rhaegar's trusted companions. Wasn't with Rhaegar when he kidnapped Lyanna or secured her away at the Tower of Joy. He arrived late to fetch Rhaegar back at the best of Aerys, when things were taking a turn for the worse during the rebellion. He stayed behind to guard Lyanna, possibly at Rhaegar's urging, but potentially because he had his own plan to deal with a Targaryen heir. And, as we see in House of the Dragon, though it's suggested, not fully brought out, Prince Baelon Targaryen, who was the father of Viserys I and Daemon, was very likely poisoned so that Otto Hightower could take his place as Hand of the King. After 5 days of illness, Baelon dies of a burst belly, fire and blood. This is an example of the widow's blood poisoned, once again mentioned in Grand Maester Pycelle's Stash of Poisons, expanded upon in one of Tyrion's chapters. Greycap, he said, in a quavery voice, from the toadstool, Nightshade, Sweet Sleep, Demon's Dance, this is Blind Eye, Widow's Blood, this one is called, for the colour. A cruel potion, it shuts down a man's bladder and bowels until he drowns in his own poisons. This is Wolfsbane, who is Basilic's Venom, and this one is the Tears of Lys. Yes, I know them all. Tyrion 9, A Storm of Swords. We must consider that if Gerald Hightower got handed his poison, it was very likely that Grand Maester Pycelle, or another Maester, gave it to him, had to prepare it for him and train him in the use of it. Given Old Town's connection to the Citadel, this would have likely been a favour that was expected and eagerly provided on his behalf, and Grand Maester Pycelle, if he knew of it, was likely involved. We see that in the case of Jon Arryn, Grandmaster Pycelle was quick to recognise the poison and stopped Master Coleman, John Aaron's own Meister, from performing the necessary purging to get rid of the poison out of his system. And, as we should realise, Grand Maester Pycelle is in the service of Tywin Lannister. I see. So my father decided to nip the rose before it bloomed. He had to chuckle. Pycelle is a toad, but better a Lannister toad than a Tyrell toad, no? Grand Maester Pycelle has always been a good friend of your house, Very said sweetly. Tyrion too, a storm of swords. And of course, at this point in the war, who stands to gain the most from Lyanna's death? It is in fact Tywin Lannister, who intends to marry his daughter Cersei to Robert, following the death of Rhaegar. He has always wanted to put one of his children on the throne. Cersei was the most likely candidate to marry to a king. She was groomed to marry Rhaegar, but since Rhaegar died first, he switched his plans to marry her to Robert. And that couldn't happen while Lyanna was still alive. While House Lannister and House Hightower are not necessarily natural allies, in this case they would have had common cause if one was served by helping the other. Confused, the king shook his head. Rhaegar won, damn him. I killed him, Ned. I drove the spike right through that black armour into his black heart. And he died at my feet. They made up songs about it, yet somehow he still won. He has Lyanna now, and I have her. The king drained his cup. Eddard 10, A Game of Thrones. Now, the very fact that Lyanna's death could have easily, plausibly, been due to a bad childbirth or complications as a result of such, or even disease in the foreign climate of Dorne, would make it the perfect circumstances for Lyanna to die of poisoning. No one would indeed question that it was poison at all. As a young girl, taken off and impregnated by a prince in a foreign climate, surrounded only by men like Sir Arthur Dayne and Sir Oswell Went, who were great warriors but not necessarily proper meisters, would not have the expertise of a midwife in order to deliver a child. Sir Gerald Hightower, with his connection to the Old Town, might seem to offer his services to Rhaegar, since Sir Gerald might suggest he has expertise in this matter which would prove useful, and thus give him the opportunity to poison Lyanna in the guise of helping her. Some of these poisons, like wolfsbane for instance, are curatives in the right circumstances, and might be unfamiliar to the other two Kingsguard. Poisons, after all, are beneath real men, and far beneath the view of knights. No one would suspect a knight of Kingsguard from being able to poison someone. So it is more than plausible that Lyanna did not die in childbirth. Thus the timeline of Jon being born exactly at the point to which Eddard approached the tower is not necessarily correct. So next time, I intend to return to explain how June relates to Robert's rebellion, and how Rhaegar could possibly still be alive.